My academic focus is African ethnomusicologists. And ethnomusicology is a cross between musicology and cultural anthropology. So I look at and relate to the world through the lens of one who sees the world as an ethnomusicologist. I'm also a performing artist. My instrument of choice is the traditional African drum and the rhythms that support and surround it. I'm also out of need to share the story of Africans and African Americans considered to be a storyteller. So I'm going to combine both of my personal focus in this particular presentation. I hope you enjoy it. The heritage of Black Americans is at odds with the erroneous perception of enslavers and exploiters of Black bodies, who by and large denied and still deny their humanity. Heritage is a measure of self that has been passed down from generation to generation, that dictates how one looks at and relates to the world. The heritage of Black Americans is heavily reliant on cultural memory, the link between the past, present, and future that is embodied in text, rites, monuments, celebrations, objects, sacred scriptures, music, and other voices from the past. And the heritage of African Americans gives rise to the spirit of resistance. Whether called colored, Negro, Black, African American, or other less endearing terms, Blacks in America have not by and large been entitled to the full measure of rights and privileges granted to others. We celebrate this heritage, nevertheless, because of those who came before us, a strong and majestic people who created themselves as a distinct culture during their 400 plus years of existence here in this space and time. Albeit within the context of the perennial struggle for survival, liberation, and civil rights. European trafficking of Black bodies that followed their exploration into the African continent and their development of wealth-producing monocrops during their colonial expansion into the Caribbean and North, South, and Central America is how we came to be. We are the result of the amalgamation of members of numerous sub-Saharan ethnic groups who survived the slave ships and their descendants. We celebrate the resistance that is central to this heritage. Awaiting those who survived the Middle Passage was a heinous system of commerce in which a chattel, an enslaved person, was owned in perpetuity, as were their children and their children's children. This dehumanization, supported by governments, monarchs, and religious leaders, was but one of the many obstacles that Blacks would have to overcome in the years that laid ahead. And their cultural memory would have to be strategically employed in order to do so. Fortunately, resilient African memories of the do's and don'ts of life, femininity, masculinity, aesthetics, worship, and spirituality were not disintegrated by the condition in which they found themselves, and race and class structure only constrained what they could do with those memories. One of the first tasks at hand was how to unify around common goals and build homogeneous community. And cultural memory would prove to be a potent means by which to do so. Accordingly, a popular music and dance practice with origins in Central and West Africa called the ring shout became a vehicle through which the separate people would come to recognize shared values and thus begin the process of making one out of many. During the ring shouts, dancers moved counterclockwise while keeping percussive rhythm with hands and feet, with gleeful onlookers adding to the festivities. Ring shouts sprung up all over the colonial colonies, most notably in New Orleans, Congo Square, and in the Pinkster celebrations of Albany, New York. And they remained a part of the African-American culture milieu even now. This use of African performing arts by way of dance, drum, and song in the context of the ring in time converged into the creation of the old Negro spirituals and the other music genres that followed, like blues, ragtime, jazz, gospel, rhythm and blues, rock and roll, and rap and hip hop. The Negro spirituals were the religious music of African Americans during slavery. It was based off of metrical compositions typically composed of rhythm couplets and loosely based on biblical scriptures. They emerged after the first Great Awakening of the 1740s. The Great Awakening was a period of religious revivalism that swept through the colonies. Christianity during this period was fervently forced upon the slaves by their masters, who at the same time were stripping them from their ancestral lands, languages, families, and cultures. Although everything was taken away from the enslaved to break them down and force assimilation, the soul of their music could not be stifled. There were several laws created to ensure control over the enslaved, including laws that prohibited their assembly without the supervision of white masters. They resisted these laws with clandestine gatherings in living quarters and in remote field gullies. The Negro spirituals were used to express their forced faith in their own way in these gatherings, carving out their own identity despite the tragedy of their circumstances. These songs also serve to communicate double entendres, song texts with double meaning. The usefulness in plantation life of these songs cannot be understated as plans to escape bondage and seek freedom and to follow the Underground Railroad were communicated via these lyrics. The legacy of Negro spirituals still survives today in the call and response style music and orations that is part of the performance practice of the Black church, and all the musics of Black Americans and their attendant cultures. After a bloody Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln, as you well know, issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This occurred on January 1st, 1863. declaring that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are henceforth free. Now, the backlash of white supremacy that followed resulted in terrorism and eventually Jim Crow segregation and the Great Migration north and west. It also resulted in the flowering of the Harlem Renaissance, which was an explosion of literary and artistic expression that built upon the agency of the spirituals, in my view, and reverberates as Black resistance even now. One of the most difficult things I get to do, or I find I have to do as a professor of Africana Studies who focuses on music culture, is to get students to fully understand that there's nothing really new under the sun. It all started somewhere, and if mama taught child, then what that child knows is what mama knew. Mm-hmm. And so when we go through the litany of different genres over time, it is very difficult for my students to understand that all is one. All is one. So you can go directly from the Negro spirituals and work your way all the way up to rap and hip hop culture, and the double entendre and the resistance that was part and parcel of those music carries through till today. The importance of this resistance is captured in a story that I'd like to share in closing.
If it's quick?
It is very quick.
Okay. Okay.
It's a good thing she doesn't have one of those little things in it.
Don't tease us.
Time was, and fire, water, good and bad lived together. One day they went hunting and they found many cattle, which they decided to share equally. But Bad wanted more for himself. So he went secretly to Water. And he said, Water, you have the power to destroy fire. Do this, and we can have his share. Water believed this, and he went and threw himself on fire, and fire was, of course, no more. Then Bad went over to Good, and he said, fire has been destroyed. It was Water who did it, so he doesn't deserve to share with us. Let's take the cattle up into the mountains and divide them equally. And so Good and Bad drove the cattle into the mountain. Water saw them go and tried to follow, but Water found that he couldn't run uphill, only down. And so they escaped. And then at a resting place, Bad turned to Good and said, foolish one, I am strong and you are weak. I am master and you are my servant. So all of the cattle shall belong to me. And Good said, I'm not your servant, and it is I who is strong. And Good went forth and he struggled with Bad. Now they fought up and down the mountain without either destroying the other. So they went before the wind and asked the wind to judge who was right. The wind listened and said, it's like this. Good is destined to struggle with Bad. Good will win, but Bad will return. And again, Good must fight for all time to come, for time immemorial. Good must fight Bad, because if he doesn't, he'll be lost forever. Thank you, good people.
Oh, we wouldn't have wanted to miss that story. I tell you, that was good.